in the room, how many of us have done street stalls here during the stop Brexit? Yeah, a lot of us
still doing them.
Still doing street. So just to say that when we started to put this away day together, we've just been to Adam Brady's wedding, seen Femi again. Mark and I went to that. Mike was there, and just realised how inspiring it was last time that we met back up in York, and how much I wanted you to spend some time with us today. But we came up with what I thought was an inspirational, how do we meet the challenge of a Labour government, which can mean so many things to so many people. I know what it means to me, but let's hear from Femi what it means to you.
Okay, I'm going to do my best Negan impression. Who are you?
Oh, yeah.
Something like that. Right now, everybody's going through an identity crisis. The Tories are trying to figure out who they are. Are they the David Cameron, we just love austerity Tories? Are we the Boris Johnson, let's destroy the economy and kill old people Tories? Are we the reform Tories that will be extremely racist while also destroying the economy and old people? They don't know who they are. The Labour Party doesn't know who they are either, because they've seen very many iterations of them. Under Jeremy Corbyn originally in 2015, it was what you would expect of a left-wing party. Then when Brexit came along, it suddenly became left-wing, but also supporting Brexit. And then when Starmer came along, it became supporting Brexit and supporting elements of austerity. But then there was the huge debate that we've had over the last 4 years of, is Starmer pretending to be a Tory, pretending to be conservative in order to just get power? Now, there were lots of people who had lots of debates as to whether or not it was necessary for him to tack so far to the right in order to appeal to a broader range of voters in order to get into power. Now, that is a debate which we can have until the cows come home, but I don't think we should be having that debate, because where we are right now is we are where we are. And whether or not you agree or don't, there are consequences to the rhetoric that Starmer used in order to get into power. He has boxed himself in certain ways. And it also has consequences for the public. One of the reasons that when you saw Nigel Farage stoking his conspiracy theories around the riots, which promoted the riots, one of the reasons Keir Starmer found it so difficult to challenge him was because he was guilty of some of the same things that Farage was guilty of. Because if you think about what caused those riots, it was this idea that immigration automatically means crime. Well, that's the rhetoric that Keir Starmer has also been guilty of pushing as well. Every time you see him ask a question about immigration, it's always linked to, well, we need safer streets, implying that immigration means crime. Whenever you hear him asked about asylum seekers, his immediate thing is smash the gangs, not people in need. Again, constantly linking immigration to crime. And that has consequences, because it then puts that in people's minds, there's that mental link, and then you get riots. I'm not saying Keir Starmer is the sole reason for it. I'm saying that this kind of rhetoric that we've seen across our politics for a very long time has consequences. And we were talking yesterday at the event that you and I were at about those riots and what they actually mean, because those are obviously a flashpoint of politics has clearly failed if we're allowing this to happen. But I very much see that as a tip of the spear, because the phrase that I used was a man in a suit is a significantly bigger threat to ethnic minorities than a thug in a balaclava. If you think about what's actually hurting ethnic minority people on a day-to-day basis, it's the systems and structures which ensure that ethnic minority people stay in poverty. It's things like the fact that Oxford University sent out 3,200 job applications just as a test to various sectors of the UK economy, and found that if you've got a Nigerian sounding name, you have to send 80% more applications to get a call back. If it's Middle Eastern, it's 90%. I think South Asian was 70%. So we know that your ability to get work, get money, passes through that filter of racism, which it means that if you're in poverty already, which lots of people right now are, it's 70 to 90% harder to escape that poverty if you're an ethnic minority. And that's all the problems linked to that, health, poverty, and malnutrition, is all stuff that affects ethnic minority people on a day-to-day basis. So the riots terrifying. I remember waking up myself from a nightmare because I dreamt that I was being pulled from my car by one of those people involved. That is obviously extremely painful, but if you just focus on the riots, you're missing the point. It's like with the abortion debate in America. Whenever you hear somebody try and make an argument for the right to choose, they always go to cases of rape and incest, which, yes, obviously that's the most horrendous cases, but you're then ignoring the fact that it's about the general right of a woman to choose what's done with their body. And if you only look at those issues, you don't really care about the right to choose. Similarly, if you think that racism is going to be solved as long as you don't have riots in the streets, you're missing the point. And that's the sort of stuff that Keir Starmer should be dealing with right now. That's the sort of stuff that Keir Starmer has to deal with. Like, for example, if you make CVs anonymous, then you don't just deal with the racial discrimination that I described earlier. You also attack issues of gender discrimination, class discrimination, because they won't be able to see which school you went to, which town you grew up in. And given that regional inequality is such a huge part of why we're here right now, like whenever I ask somebody, whenever somebody asks me how we ended up with Brexit, I always tell the story about the 50-year-old in Sunderland, Hull, Redcar, Swansea, an area that's been left behind. They've seen no investment in their area for their entire life. They've hated the Tories. Their area always votes Labour, which means that neither party has anything really to play for in their area, so none of the parties actually help them. And the first time they had a chance to vote for things to change was the referendum. And the person telling them to vote for things to stay the same was David Cameron, the same person who'd been financially strangling them for the previous 6 years via austerity. That regional inequality is so baked into why we're where we are. And so the things that need to change are along the lines of dealing with the stuff that led to the riots, but also the underlying racism there, discrimination there, the inequality there, but also regional inequality at the same time. And when we're looking at how we're going to judge Keir Starmer now and the challenge of the Labour Party, as I said, we had that debate about what kind of party they are. Was it right to do what they did in terms of saying that kind of rhetoric, which is problematic for the reasons I've just described? But those excuses of we just have to get the Tories out are gone. Right now, I'm still hearing some people saying things along the lines of, oh, but he's got to say this, he's got to say that, because the right-wing mail, the blah, 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 blah. Yeah, the whole point of any kind of political strategy is so that you can get into power and create change. That's the whole point. If you're still bending what you actually do in power to the whims of the Daily Mail, then your priority is not actually making that change, it's keeping the Daily Mail happy. Because you got the power. You got more power than we've seen any government have in a very long time. A huge majority. We thought 80 was huge. I think we're on like, what is it, 146? What's it now? 114. Insane majority.
No, I was thinking something else. Sorry, I'll shut up.
But they've got the power. So what they do now with that power determines who the Labour Party actually is. Now, the reason why I asked who are you is because they're going through an identity crisis. The Tories are going through an identity crisis, but we as commentators, voters, protesters, writers, who we are is determined right now by who Labour is. For a very long time, we've seen ourselves as very much the opposition to government for the last 14 years. And me as a millennial, this is the first time I've ever had to deal with the Labour government as an adult. This is the first non-Tory government I've seen as an adult. And so who am I if I'm not shouting at the Tories? And so to know who we are requires an understanding of who the Labour Party is. And so for that, I spent the last 2-3 months or so since the election basically just trying to figure out who they are. Because as I said, what they do now is who they are. There's no excuse of getting the Tories out. And the best way I can describe it is, unlike the Tories, which were basically driving in the opposite direction of everything we want, running into oncoming traffic of a society that is more progressive. So they're like going the wrong way down the motorway. The Labour is more a car that is just in the wrong gear. They might be going in the right direction on a lot of things, but they're in the wrong gear. And the progressive generations that are trying to move are being held back by a government that refuses to move at the speed that we need them to move at. So how do we deal with that as people that are commentating on that? We need to figure out why they're moving so slowly and how we can encourage them to move forward. And one of the things that I figured out is we keep hearing from Keir Starmer things like, oh, this budget's going to be painful. We've had to cut winter fuel allowance. We can't scrap the two-child cap because we haven't got the money. And they're passing this fiscal lock bill, fiscal responsibility bill, which basically says that any economic decision they make has to be analyzed by the Office of Budget Responsibility. And their rationale is that they're trying to avoid a repeat of Liz Truss. That they don't want to spend money they don't have, they can only do what we can afford. And they're basically using the OBR as their guideline for what we can afford. That kind of opens themselves up, because if you say that, you also have to look at what else the OBR says, because it's the elephant in the room. Brexit. If the OBR is saying that Brexit is costing 4% of your economy, which is equivalent to about £100 billion, and therefore £40 billion in tax revenue, and you're saying that all your decisions have to be consistent with what the OBR says we can afford, you're writing into law that you have to undo Brexit. And because that and as for the actual mechanisms of making that happen, yes, obviously it involves negotiations with the EU, but you could say on day one, it is the policy of the UK government that we believe we need to return to the single market. The single market, not necessarily the EU, the single market, i.e. undoing the trade barriers in Dover to improve the economy. It is the policy of this government that we will do that as soon as possible. If that were to happen, then we saw what happened in 2016 when the referendum result was announced. We saw the pound plummet because investors across the world found out that the UK would no longer be integrated into the supply chains of Europe. Whereas if we are announced now that the UK will soon be a place where anything you make here will be automatically legal to sell in every country in Europe, that would send the pound shooting up immediately. So while it would take time, months, maybe years, I would hope it could be done within maybe a year, maybe 2-3 years to get fully back into the single market. You would see benefits immediately if Keir Starmer came out today and said, we want to go back to the single market. Not to mention, a lot of the arguments you'll also hear in opposition to that is along the lines of, well, the EU has such a bad opinion of us, you have to get all of them to agree, etc. But you can't make both arguments at the same time, because one of the reasons the EU is reluctant on the UK is because we've been such a basket case for the last 8 years. The best way to improve that is to make us a more appealing option to the EU. And part of that will involve electoral reform, because the Tories consistently get into power off a minority of the vote, even though the majority has consistently voted for parties to the left of the Conservatives in almost every election since World War II. And you also need to, and also if the leader of the government was saying, we are done with Theresa May's red lines, we are done with Tory ideology, we want to be fully connected to Europe, to the EU, to those supply chains, that would be a huge signal to the UK, to the EU, that would improve their perception of us and make rejoining the single market easier. So you can't argue both ways at the same time. I would also argue right now, in terms of how we convince Labour, we should use reform, because they are in large part the stick. Because if Labour doesn't do what is necessary to significantly improve quality of life, especially for working class people, over the next 5 years, then people will lose faith in both Labour and the Tories, and Nigel Farage will walk into Parliament over the crunching bones of the two previous parties. That is the stick. And so if Keir Starmer wants to do this whole slowly thing, while still using quite conservative right-wing language to describe it, like the whole point of getting into power, as it comes back to, is you're supposed, if you believe in progressive values, you should be using the fact that you're in power to show people that progressive policies, progressive politics will improve your life. So even if you're doing the progressive things while saying right-wing things, you're undermining how well you can convince people that progressive policies will help them. So even if Keir Starmer goes through this next parliament while still saying stuff that's quite right-wing, he'll just make it easier for Nigel Farage to then say, oh, but things would have been better if he'd actually done the right-wing stuff as well. So we should be using Nigel Farage as the stick to say, look, if you don't do this progressive stuff, if you don't actually help this progressive revolution, which should be happening right now, especially given the way Gen Z feels about politics, then you are just creating a rotary run back. And as I mentioned before, the ultimate issue here is proportional representation. Because that's, some of you may have seen, I managed to catch up with West Streeting at party conference, even though they wouldn't let me in. And I said, so you have 34% of the vote, well, 33.9, and you have 62% of the seats in Parliament. Which means that even though the majority of votes went to other parties, those votes don't really affect anything because you can overrule them, which means the majority of British votes have no effect on policymaking. That can't be a democracy. So do you believe that we should change that? He said it's not a priority. And I said, but so democracy isn't a priority, democracy doesn't matter. He said, well, of course democracy matters. So okay, so you want the majority of British votes to count? He said, no. I said, wait, no. And he thought that was some kind of like gotcha, oh, Femi, don't be silly, is what he said. And I was like, but you are telling me no. I'm asking you, should the majority of British votes count? And you're saying it's not a priority. That's a no. And given that, as I said, how Gen Z feels about politics, how millennials feel about politics, we are seeing a tidal shift. Like there was also a conservative that I actually happened to overhear in Costa at conference. He was at the table next to me and he was talking about how the Tory party is scared about this being pulled in two massively different directions because they've got the Reform Party eating into their vote. And so like, do we tack more towards them? Are we not right-wing enough? But they're also seeing what they refer to as this tidal wave of Gen Z who will never vote Tory. And do we have to do something to try and win those votes and maintain some kind of appeal among the younger generations? And that's where we're going. Now, the question is, how fast do we go there? And if, as I said, the majority consistently votes for parties to the left, the Conservatives, the most logical thing would be to make sure every vote counts equally. And so I think that what we need to be doing as a movement is alongside President Keir Starmer to do better on all the different policy issues we all care about, we need to make it so that Keir Starmer can't get through a single interview without somebody asking him, so Starmer, why do you believe the majority of British votes shouldn't count? I think that question should be inescapable for him. Any questions?
Wow.
So, Femi, you touched on proportional representation. Recently, Reform have been complaining bitterly about how many votes they had and how many seats they had, which is unfortunately one more than the Greens got, but I was gutted when the last result came in. But do you think we should be using that as a tool to go for proportional representation?
As in, should we be sort of aligning ourselves with, well, let's just say again, sorry.
Do you think we should be poking Nigel Farage, etc., to be backing proportional representation?
Oh, he already is. I did a video on this not long after the election about like, is Nigel Farage now the good guy because he's supporting PR? And I made the point that it's so nakedly a push, a grasp for power just on his end. He doesn't actually care about all votes counting equally. We know that because I think Ben Habib specifically said that they were pushing for, they refused to have a second referendum on Brexit, but they said we should go for an election. And Ben Habib's words, because you can win on barely 30% of the vote. So they don't care whether or not people are actually represented correctly. They just care about whatever they think will work for them. Because if we get to a couple of years' time and it looks like Reform can win on 30% of the vote under first past the post, they'll abandon PR immediately. They don't care. But yes, on PR, you will have the argument of we can't have PR because then we'll have lots and lots of Reform Party MPs. There's the argument that if we had PR at this last election, they would have maybe 100. And I'm totally cool with that. Yeah. Totally cool with that for a number of reasons. One, if we are a country that has 10, 15% that wants to vote for the far right, then we are a country that has 15% wants to vote for the far right. we shouldn't use an unfair voting system to hide who we actually are.
Mm.
Second reason is because so much of the narrative of the far right has been take back control, people are powerless. Well, we want to give people power, and we take the bullet out of that gun if we say no, we are actually the left is trying to give people power. Secondly, this argument of they're being silent, the system is against them. Again, take the bullet out of their gun, take it away from them. And the main thing is we've had to have these arguments with battling the far right for 8 years. We all got surprised by the Brexit result because that conversation had been happening for years, but it hadn't been happening in public, hadn't been happening in Parliament, it had been happening on back alley Facebook groups. I would much rather fight Nigel Farage in the light of day. I mean that metaphorically. I'd much rather battle him in Parliament where everyone can see it rather than him channeling it through whatever Facebook pushes he now. I want him to actually stand up in Parliament and say, no, this is what I want to do. Because if Nigel Farage had to actually give a plan for what he wanted to do with Brexit and actually lay it out in the 10, 20 years before we actually left the EU, Brexit would have had to nail his colours to a specific mast. Is it no deal? Is it single market? Is it simple free trade deal? And then the consequences of that would have been obvious from here.
Dominic, I think you had your hand up, and then Kate, who is on Zoom. So Dominic first.
Yeah, kind of like questions for you, but also points for the room in general to consider about PR, which is, let's take a hypothetical and say that we've got Labour behind us, which we sort of have because their policy forum does acknowledge that first past the post contributes to disillusionment with politics. Right, let's think about the mechanics of PR. The concerns that people have about it, like the link between a member of the constituency. What do you do about by-elections or other things where there's only one position available? You know, how do you cope with, say, an MP resigning? Do you have a by-election, or do you have like a sort of queue of people who've been pre-elected and standing by? Why don't we commission articles about that, have a thorough discussion of everything through the medium of bylines, and that way we can not only start raising the tone and the voice of that PR, but we can also start preempting the questions that are inevitably going to come up as and when, you know, we start winning the debate about whether we should change the voting system. So it's kind of like for everyone to consider, but also for your thoughts on that.
So 3 points on that. I'll work them back. As far as raising those issues and having that discussion, while it's important to have that discussion, I think we should also have the conversation around the positives of PR rather than what potential slip-ups there are. I agree that those things seem to come up, but if we start primarily focusing on the potential complications that we have to work out, I think that would then create this idea that, oh, PR is too complicated, and that's the reason why AB lost in 2011. So we should do both, promote the positives and also say we've got the solutions as well. On the topic of solutions, I had this, who was it, Jess Phillips, when I bumped into her at the previous party conference, I asked her about PR, and her initial reaction was the constituency link thing. And so I made the point that, hang on, but if the majority of votes goes to parties that can't actually do anything in Parliament, then the majority of people will have voted for an MP, whether that MP wins or doesn't, that doesn't actually have any power. So that constituency link is essentially meaningless for the majority of people. Even if you're in a conservative area where the Tory MP has won off 37, 41% of the vote, 60% of the people in that constituency don't feel represented by their MP. So that constituency link isn't strong. You had a second point about PR, by-elections.
Yes.
Yeah, on that point, I'd say one of the options for PR is list systems. So if whatever percentage of the vote each party gets, they'll get that percentage of the MPs in any given area. And so if it's done by list, i.e., if Lib Dems get 3 MPs, the top 3 on their party list, top candidates on the party list will be the ones. Then if this MP gets fired or resigned, then it goes to the next MP down. But I'd also say that we aren't the first ones inventing the wheel on this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we are the only country, other than Belarus, we're the only country in Europe that uses first past the post. So we can easily borrow options follow solutions from other countries that do use port representation.
Okay, I'm trying to balance from the room as well. Kate, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Femi, so I'm Kate Moore from East Anglia Bylines.
Hang on.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
So I'm Kate Moore from East Anglia Bylines. I'm completely with you on PR, and as you say, if other countries can do it, there's no reason why we can't. But what really worries me and concerns me, the more I kind of write, is the stranglehold that big business actually has on policy. It's whether it's big pharma, big food, big construction, you name it, big private healthcare. And increasingly, I come to the belief that, to be perfectly honest, it doesn't really matter much, really, how we vote, because policy is so much dictated by these big corporates. So how do we change that? Because I know I'm not alone in that view. And it's almost a view that if there is if what I'm saying is actually fairly accurate, it's also a view that also says, well, what's the point of me voting? Which is also not a good thing. But so how do we stop the stranglehold of big whatever?
So
Thanks, Dave.
working back to front. The point in voting, yes, I've just given a huge argument about how the majority of British votes don't count, but unless we actually fix that, then what are we playing for? Like, so much of the stuff that I see would give you reason to want to give up, but ultimately giving up is harder, because if we give up, then we're just being hit by this crappy system constantly for the rest of our lives and our kids' lives. As for how do we change it so that we reduce and get rid of the stranglehold that big business has on policy, I think that PR is a necessary step. It's not a sufficient step, but it's a necessary step to getting there, because the two-party system, that duopoly, is, well, like a duopoly in business. It means that we don't actually have the control that we need to make change. Politicians aren't scared of people. I'm not going to get too deep of Vanessa here, but that's the way it should be. And so if we did have PR, that would be a step towards that. And I think once we get that, we're then more likely to get the kind of legislation that bans or at least thoroughly restricts the amount of money that any specific organization or group of organizations or even sector can donate to fund a political party. I think getting money out of politics is the way to stop money influencing politics. So again, it links to second jobs, it links to things like the Owen Paterson scandal, those sorts of things. I think that's the way to prevent the bigness of business having that stranglehold.
Thank you. Can we go to Claire and then Mike, and then we're back in Zoom? And can you introduce yourself for the benefit of anyone on Zoom?
Hello, I'm Claire Jones. I am fully a PR advocate, and I've written quite a few articles supporting PR. But I think there's a practical and a sort of structural problem with it at the moment. The practical one is that I also work with Compass, as we know, and in my regional group, I quite a few people leave because they are not happy with the PR community's explanation of the fact that UKIP would perhaps have up to 100 MPs in the PR system. So there's a difficulty in selling it because of the far right issues that we have here at the moment. But I actually think that if we look to Europe, PR is not working well in Europe at the moment. And I think that if we're going to think through PR and sell it properly, we have to look at what those problems are. The sort of standard explanations, one of the standard explanations is, well, PR simply reflects the makeup of the community and it remains democratic. And, you know, if the community is sliding far right, then PR will simply reflect that. But I think that one of the problems with it is that if you have a voting system that enables a large proportion of far right parties to get into power, you are inadvertently, if you like, legitimizing that voice. And that's not to say that we shouldn't have PR or the first past post is any better, I don't think it is. But I think that we need to put it bluntly, stop kidding ourselves that PR is a cure-all for far right thinking. And I think we need to represent it as an abstract system that can swing far left or far right, and that we need constitutional changes outside the voting system itself to anchor it to the centre. And we need that here in the UK as much as they could have done in Europe, but haven't succeeded in doing that. Anyway, that's just my kind of devil's advocate. Second thought on PR, but I'd be interested to know.
So in law, the phrase that we always use is necessary but not sufficient. I.e., PR is a necessary step to get where we need to go, but it's not the cure all, as you described. And I would also say that the reason that things aren't working in Europe is not so much because of PR. As you said, PR is simply a reflection of what people want. I believe it's because, I mean, look at the cases where you see the far right rise, and it's because working class people have not been served properly. It's one of the biggest huge pushes towards Marine Le Pen in France is when Macron did things like raise the retirement age. Any of his policy that seems to be not geared towards helping working class people and actually addressing poverty head on has been pushing people into the arms of the far right. I remember one of the most important conversations I had during the Brexit years with a guy in Wolverhampton who voted for Brexit, wasn't a huge fan of the Tories, but not too tough with Labour either. So you're just your stereotypical person who's right fertile ground for the far right to actually get a clause into it. And he said, if we were all on £1,000 a week, none of us would care. We all go on the streets dancing. It's not because they're particularly attracted to the idea of hating their neighbours. It's because things are not going well for them and they're desperate for a solution to fix that.
Absolutely agree. Oh, sorry, I went to this conversation, but there are socio-economic factors that explain why people vote far right. But we're also at the moment suffering from this enormous social media right campaign, and that in a way is kind of separate. We've also got, political dog whistling as well. So there are other factors that aren't solved by making people beg off.
I agree that there's definitely a cultural element to this, and there's one point that, sorry, I forgot to mention it, the social media element of things, in the sense of, you said that if we allowed them into Parliament, that would give them a sense of legitimacy, but the question is legitimacy in whose eyes? In the eyes of a lot of people, a lot of young people, and also the kind of people that Reform Party are trying to aim for, having the word politician in your name does not add legitimacy to you. In fact, arguably the opposite. And so it simply allows us a platform to challenge them, and we do need to address it on social media as well, which again leads to things like TikTok, etc. And that the left is fundamental. The mainstream establishment left has failed to address TikTok properly. The Labour Party is not doing well on their Farage is doing far better. But there are lots and lots of young creators on TikTok who are amazing, better than me on a bunch of issues. Lots of whom I know. We're creating this sort of community we could do with a bit more structure. But the mainstream, like incumbent left, that are actually going on Sky News in the party, they're not taking advantage of the fact that there's an army out there of millennials and Gen Z on TikTok who would be amazing if given that kind of power, and would fundamentally just swipe out the far right in a kind of cultural sense. But the mainstream left is slow to pick that up.
Mike.
Hi, so I have a question, but first, quick comment on that PR stuff, and that's if the states had PR, Donald Trump would never have come in. And if you look at the election happening now, there are about 4 swing states that everyone's focusing on. And that means that in some states where you've got millions of people voting, they're being neglected because they are red states or they're blue states, but particularly with the red states. And so for us, as a network that is very much about the local empowerment of democracy, it is so much richer, so much more purposeful, and so much more focused when the difference you can make at a local level does actually count at all levels, all up to the national. If you're trying to change minds in areas that are politically dead in terms of change, that's a massive disincentive in order to stop drifts to far left and far right. So in terms of long-term health, I personally believe that PR is necessary for the enrichment and variation and engagement of democracy at a local level too. Okay, so that's that point. My question is, you said something great right at the beginning of term of life, which is, Keir Starmer has just come into power. He seems to be tipping his hat to the Daily Mail. And the Daily Mail didn't win the election, the Labour Party did. So why is the Daily Mail in power?
Yeah.
And my big concern is that by Keir Starmer doing this, he has let the marginals, the Labour Tory marginal voter base and their champions and the right-wing press is let them know that they are still in power. You know, his whole working people shtick, you know, doesn't care about the kids, doesn't care about all people. Working people, by which he means working class people who've got certain attitudes about immigration, etc. But it really empowers the right-wing mainstream media. And my question from the sort of Bylines network is, how do we break that dominance of that media over broadcast media and over political thinking when we know the circulation of this print press is dropping, but still all the broadcast media are doing what's in the papers, and being led by the nose by that? How do we, as building up alternative media, start breaking that psychological dominance that has been baked in?
So I'd say we have to look at where Keir Starmer is weak. Keir Starmer is weak among Gen Z and millennials. His support there is hanging by a thread.
Yeah.
And so pointing out that Keir Starmer is at risk of losing a part of the electorate that is necessary for him to stay in power. And that if he chooses the Daily Mail over them, it's going to end up poorly for him. Like I did the maths, and if you look, I think was it 34% of 2024 Labour voters support scrapping the two-child cap. And so to fire MPs that represent a section of your electorate that you needed to get into power is an interesting one. And that making the point that without those people, without the people that are towards the left of your party, you're done.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of threat is necessary. I think how Bylines would take advantage of that would be to try and, whether it's getting comment from, whether it's even hiring as many young TikTok voices as you can that are saying the kind of stuff that progressives actually care about.
I was going to come on to that. Would your network be interested in writing articles or being interviewed?
Yeah, I can get that.
That would be cool.
Thank you. Peter, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, and a different point of view, but in response to that, I mean, I think our strategy dealing with the might of the right, as it were, is not to try and target the Tommy Robbinsons of this world whom we'll never persuade or their adherents, but to actually work on the people who are on our side but apathetic, and to work on telling people, especially the young who don't vote very much, that it is worthwhile fighting for what they believe in. I think that's to a great extent what we do. We don't need to flagellate ourselves over talking to the converted, because the converted need to be converted twice, once to believe and twice to fight. But my main point was about PR, and I agree with everything Femi said there. Indeed, I share the slight misgivings, but overwhelmingly, I think the time has come for change. And I come from Ireland, where obviously PR has been in place since 1922, or indeed before, introduced oddly enough by the British government, who thought that they could stop Sinn Féin with PR. How that's worked. However, I've had the chance to vote in Irish elections. I was convinced each time that my vote counted. I lived for 30 years in a constituency in England where the Tories have been winning since 1906. And therefore, my vote simply didn't matter. And I think it's not solely a matter of being proportional, but also being enfranchising for the majority of people. Our system isn't as bad as the American one, where constituencies are, well, voting areas of massively different sizes. But at least in the UK, all constituencies are about the same size. That's one good thing. But nonetheless, it doesn't replace the need for some degree of fairness. Now, I wanted to ask Femi a question, which is this. I mean, Keir Starmer obviously has never said in as many words that he's avidly against PR, but he wants to see other things happen first. And he keeps saying it's not a priority. It doesn't suit Labour at the moment. However, he's going to have a problem when he tries to abolish the House of Lords and replace it with an electorate chamber. Because either he's going to bring in PR, in which case people are going to say, well, if it's good enough for the Lords, why isn't it good enough for the Commons? Or he's going to bring in first past the post as a system for electing the second chamber, in which case he would be upsetting quite a lot of Labour supporters who are predominantly in favour of PR, as indeed I suspect a very large portion of Labour MPs. So I think that's going to be not only a bit of a dilemma for him, but an opportunity for us. What do you think?
I fundamentally agree with that point. I would say, I would also add to it that the not a priority point that they keep making explains to me why reform of the House of Lords is more of an urgent priority than PR in the House of Commons. I don't want that argument as well on top of that, but I fundamentally agree with what you said.
Thanks, Peter. Jenny, can you unmute yourself?
Sure. Building a little on what Peter said, it's not exactly a question, but as the network's inclusivity coordinator, I feel obliged to point out that the UK includes countries which already have PR. It's very strange sitting here in Scotland hearing about how nobody knows how to cope with this and we've no idea what it would do. It's worked pretty well for us. We haven't had a problem with the far right particularly. We haven't had anybody from the far left either for about 15 years. We have great participation from young people comparatively. That's because I think they feel that there's more opportunity for their vote to mean something. I wonder what it is about so many English people that makes them feel uniquely incapable of coping with this system.
Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. And as you said, young people engagement, and there was studies done about how when they introduced 16 votes for 16-year-olds, then improved general voter participation throughout their entire lives. So that's fundamentally great. And it's weird that, well, not weird, it's interesting that 16-year-old votes for 16-year-olds has somehow disappeared from the agenda of the Labour Party, despite promising that during the election. Yeah, fundamentally great. It's insane that we act like this is some new concept, even though not only is PR a common thing across our continent, but also within our own United Kingdom.
Let's go from Scotland to Wales. Rachel.
Thank you. Hi, Femi. I'm Rachel from Bylines Cymru. As we all know, so-called think tanks have played a huge role in a lot of what the Tories did, Tufton Street and all the rest, the American dark money and so on, for everything from Brexit to free ports. What's your sense after researching who Labour is of whether they will continue to play a role in the way that they have, and or whether the Charity Commission might finally be forced to deal with some of them not being education charities and so on?
I would say that press reform is a topic which was talked about a little bit before the election. It seems to not be treated. It seems to be one of those not a priority things for Labour now. And that comes into how we constantly keep getting the IEA on question time, etc., and the power that they have basically put forward whoever they want, whether that's think tanks or former chancellors who committed tax fraud and ending up on question time. I think I agree with you that should be a priority in terms of dealing with their access to the media and the control that they have. It's also a weakness that we have on the left in the sense that we don't really have that the left-wing think tank thing that is then able to get progressive voices onto those TV shows in the same way the right does. I think that's something that we need to start doing. I keep saying there's so many young, great voices that would be great if we did create some left-wing groups that would actually be able to then get them onto the mainstream media. But I fundamentally agree with your point. It's something that I think Labour isn't taking seriously and should do.
So segueing from a young great voice, Alex Mayer, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, am I audible to all?
You are, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I've enjoyed the debate a lot, and I agree with a lot of the points about electoral reform, but I just want to pivot away slightly because I don't want it to be too dominated by electoral reform. And I want to talk a bit more about the other side of Keir Starmer, which is the Keir Starmer government. It's pinned basically everything on economic growth. in the next 4 to 5 years. It's like it's gone into a betting shop and put everything on the horse called growth. And we've just been through a very long and very worker unfriendly recession since 2008. And the thing about growth is you don't just have to make 4%, which is like the ideal percentage figure. You have to make all the growth back that people have lost in their wage slips. So that's, I think, I don't know much about economics, but a very, very, you don't have to know a lot to say that's going to be a very, very ambitious target. And you'd have to hit it by about 2006, 2007. But I think obviously these electoral reform aspects and Brexit are important, and I certainly support all that. But can I just ask a very open question? What do you think we should be doing to be preparing for what happens when the growth doesn't materialize, or doesn't materialize in enough quantities, and there's a huge drop off in support for the and good faith for the Labour government when people actually don't feel a massive change? Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, so again, that's where it comes back to the stick that we use on Keir Starmer, because what do we do to prepare for Keir Starmer's main policies for how he helps people, i.e. growth, fails over the next few years? Prepare for Prime Minister Nigel Farage. That's the answer. Because if he doesn't do what he needs to do in order to improve people's quality of life, then people will have lost faith in both major parties. Because I don't see the Tory party rehabilitating themselves over the next few years, and Keir Starmer will be the party of government. A lot of people will want to get rid of them if they don't deliver. As for what you said about constantly betting exclusively on growth, I fundamentally agree with you. Yes, hitting back against Brexit, undoing the barriers of Brexit in terms of rejoining the single market is a necessary. Well, sorry, it's one of the key elements of fixing the issue of lack of growth. But there are also other levers we can pull, namely the fact that the UK is, I think, the fourth most financially unequal country in Europe, despite being one of the largest economies in the world. We have the money to if we redistributed wealth, to pull millions of people out of poverty. And it is an economic decision whether or not it's a political decision whether or not you do that. So Keir Starmer does have levers at his disposal. It's about whether or not he actually wants to go for the people who actually have the resources. And that also joins to other issues in terms of who do people blame for the fact that they haven't got the money, the resources they need to cope. And do they blame minorities, or do they blame people who actually have the money?
Do you have any questions in the room? We've been in Zoom for a while. Anyone in the room that wants to ask Femi something? Has he covered absolutely everything? I want to know, it's a bit of a nebulous sort of unformed question, but for Yorkshire, we have Leeds, we've had the Hare Hills right recently. We obviously have Hull, we have Rotherham, we have Doncaster, which apparently is going to be a #1 target seat for Nigel Farage when that's going to be his target seat, because I think there's a by-election coming up, or there's some local elections, mayoral. I really should have researched this. What would you have? Obviously, Yorkshire Bylines is also in the room here. What would you have us do? So we're not TikTokers, but you are a journalist as well. What would you have us do if we're covering Doncaster to try and wrestle that away? Or do you think actually it's more important that Nigel Farage maybe gets that hold so that stick is a little bit more obvious there? Do we, what would you do?
I think it's in both directions, but I would hesitate against trying to help Nigel Farage get more MPs into Parliament. But I do take the point as how that could work and how we could take advantage of that if it were to come to pass. I think that's what I'm saying. We have an advantage over other countries in Europe and across the Western world in the sense that we've already seen the right-wing agenda play out. I said it yesterday, I made this joke today, that we have to look at what the same people behind the riots have been doing for the last 8 years. Like, they have all been focused on Brexit. That was their main focus for the past, like, if you found out that in the 8 years before 9/11, Nigel Farage was investing in Oreos cookies, you'd probably look at the ingredients on those biscuits before you ate them. We should be looking at what the people have been doing, and they've already shown what their agenda has done, and that has made people poorer. And in terms of what we can do to highlight and break down the narrative of the far right in terms of trying to get elected in, say, Doncaster, I think because we've already seen their agenda play out, we have all the evidence we need. We have Nigel Farage saying that Brexit has failed. We have not benefited economically from Brexit. I went to the Reform Party conference, a Reform Party's rally in Stafford this summer, and I got 3 Reform Party candidates to say on record A, Brexit's making us poor, B, we plan to do a no-deal Brexit if we got into power, and C, if that were to happen, it would significantly damage our food supply for the next 20 years.
Incredible.
They're on record as saying this stuff. So, and these phrases like you've got to take medicine to get better, sometimes you've got to take a little pain for it to work. That's the phrases that we're coming out with. So, if this is played to working class people, tell me one working class people that's actually struggling in this country that would be okay with 20 years of food poverty as something they would actively vote for. And that's what we need to be using if we want to actually beat them, because it frustrates me that they're still making strides when they're all on record as being the bad guys. And it's one of the things that annoys me about this whole like Keir Starmer can't touch Brexit because what if the Nigel Farage goes out and no, tell me somebody that you can have this that you would lose this argument with, because you would simply say no, but you said it's making us poor. Like, and Kevin Badenoch said that Brexit has been especially traumatic for the car industry. Rishi Sunak said it's the reason why our trade is falling behind other countries. There's nobody in Parliament who would win an argument on Brexit because they've all admitted that it's making people poor. So, in terms of how we push back against these people, just show what they've said.
Yeah, okay, it's interesting. We during the referendum campaign, the Barnsley MP, Steph Peacock, was saying that we need to have Brexit, and then people in her constituency need to experience how bad Brexit will be in order to turn it around. But unfortunately, we've got Brexit, we're experiencing it, and that's not turning it around. And you only need to look at Donald Trump and what's happening in America to look at the actual evidence.